Good afternoon or good morning, depending on the time zone that you might be tuning in from today. Welcome back to another session at FinTech Nexus. Today, we're going to be talking about SMS fraud. So before we get into our conversation, with Kevin and myself, just wanted to, first, a special thanks to Kevin and the team at Arcos. They've been longtime supporters of FinTech Nexus, even when we were called Lend It previously. So appreciate the continued support. Without supporters and partners like them, we obviously can't do sessions like this. As well as to the audience, whether you're joining us live or you're going to watch this as a video replay. We appreciate your attention. We obviously know everyone's busy, so giving us your time, we appreciate that. And obviously, without audience members and people that watch these, ultimately, we can't do sessions like this either. And to the audience, if you have questions, we want this to be interactive. So at any point, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes in, just go ahead and pose questions. We'll answer those questions. Obviously, Kevin will be doing more of those answerings than I will in terms of SMS fraud, but we encourage you to pose your questions to the session. And just a quick reminder, coming up in May 10th and 11th, we have FinTech Nexus USA. You could still sponsor, you could still speak, and you can also buy tickets, obviously. So check out fintechnexus.com for all the details. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. Kevin, just give us a little bit of background on your company, Arcos, and a little bit about what you guys do to kind of set the stage before we jump into our talk.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And it's always great to join these sessions. So we appreciate having the opportunity to present from all you fine folk fighting the good fight every day out there against fraud and criminals. So I'm the CEO and founder of Arcos. Arcos Labs is a bot mitigation security tool that is used to stop adversaries from making money at a large number of companies. We work with a lot of the leading fintechs, a lot of the leading tech companies, video game companies, travel companies, all kinds of great partners that we're very fortunate to do that business with. And we're very focused on preventing criminals from making money. So everything we build at Arcos is through the objective of ultimately preventing the adversary from profiting. We do that through technology. We also do that through partnership. We have a 24/7 managed SOC that focus on ensuring the moment an attack starts, we shut it down as quickly as possible, because again, you don't want the bad actors to be making money for too long. So it's a little bit about Arcos.
Great. So I'm going to pop up a couple of slides here, but when we talk about our topic, which is how stopping SMS fraud maximizes your own ROI, can you give us a background of exactly what we mean when we say SMS fraud, for those in the audience who might not be schooled in the topic and who are here to learn a little bit more, maybe just a background on kind of exactly where we're focusing our attention here today.
Yeah, no, there's quite a few parts to the word SMS fraud, and there's a few different thoughts as to what that may mean. I think first and foremost, it might be worth mentioning, what do people use SMS for in the kind of fintech world? So there's kind of one primary reason SMS is being used by the fintechs themselves or financial institutions, and that's around things like multi-factor authentication and OTP. So to secure users' accounts, we collect their phone numbers, and then when they're trying to log in to verify it's actually them logging in, we send them a PIN. They type in that PIN into our app or into our website, and then, of course, we have confidence that it's actually them trying to log in the first place. The reason why we do that is to prevent things like credential stuffing or other forms of attacks, where if you're just using a username and password, because unfortunately, as we all know, people reuse passwords way too often, and it's really hard to stop them from doing that. There's a big vulnerability there where if any other company is breached, that person also used the same password out, and then they can go use a bot to test it on your website. They can compromise accounts and get in. So that's, of course, why we obviously highly recommend adoption of multi-factor authentication. Now, SMS's place in this is kind of interesting. So there's a few, I would call kind of low barrier to entry forms of authentication where the user is easily enrolled in it without them having to do a lot of work. So email one-time password is a good example. So if you're trying to log in to an account, you've got the username and password correctly, we can send a pin to their email address, and then they can type in the email that code into the login flow. The problem there is you're kind of putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, because if the email is compromised, it's really hard to prevent an adversary from then, of course, getting into the account. So we tend to not too often use email. Phone is kind of the next easiest one, because all they need to do is provide a phone number and you can just send them a pin. Like, they don't really need to go and get an app or do anything like that. So it's actually the highest adopted form of multi-factor authentication, just because of the ease of getting the consumer to actually opt into it. And therefore, we have a lot of people using SMS. There's a lot of pros and cons to SMS, but we'll kind of leave it there for now. And then, of course, there's a lot of really strong multi-factor authentication methods that we would all prefer they use. Things like tokens, authenticator apps, all this kind of stuff, right? And we were, Todd and I were chatting a little bit earlier. Some companies only allow you to use those, which are definitely inherently more secure. It just puts the onus on the consumer to download an app, to set up the, scan the QR code, type in the PIN, make sure it's in sync. And if they ever change their, if they change their phone or the app is deleted, then there's a whole complexity around how I now recover or get into my account. I got to reach out to support. People don't really change their phone numbers very often or at all.
Especially these days when you can port so simply now. It's
yeah, exactly. Like I got a new phone number when I moved to the US. I'm from Australia originally. I'm now based in the Bay Area, but I can't see myself changing that phone number anytime soon. Of course, like all your friends or your family, everyone knows that number. I use it for work. Like, you're kind of stuck with that number for life. Like, there's not, unless you're changing countries, that's kind of the only extreme scenario where you change a number. So very infrequently. So again, that makes it a pretty good, stable, static security mechanism, in the sense that you're probably going to have the same thing. Unfortunately, of course, as you say, it's pretty easy to port a number. And I know we're not going to go into detail on this today, but one of the vulnerabilities with SMS as verification method is bad actors can also port your number, which you don't really want. Because if they go and port your number, then obviously they can kind of get into the account. So what we're going to talk today about is a form of SMS fraud which abuses one-time PIN or multi-factor for the criminal to make money from you, basically. So what they're doing is they use bots that actually abuse your OTP process to run up your SMS bills. And we'll talk about kind of what you should look for in a moment. But the reason why they can make money from this mechanism is they get effectively affiliated phone numbers from telcos in high-cost nations, mostly in Europe, where they make about 10% of the text messages sent to these phone numbers. And they can get virtually unlimited phone numbers from these carriers. And their incentive is, how do I get as many text messages sent to my affiliated numbers? Because I make money every time I get you to send me a text message. So what they're doing is they're going and enrolling in accounts or triggering OTP against their own phone numbers where they make money. And then basically the fintech or the bank is now sending text messages and actually getting charged a pretty premium rate. In some countries like Indonesia, it's 30 cents to send a text message. If you jump kind of to the
there you go.
this kind of a good example of the price delta. This kind of fraud doesn't really happen in the US because the value for making a text message isn't really worthwhile for the adversary. But in a number of countries in Europe, it's quite expensive sending text messages. And if you have customers globally, you can't really just turn off SMS. And you can even see on this list, UK is one of the countries that they do this fraud from, because it's still a decent amount of money. Like, it's not a huge amount of money. You're not going to do this kind of fraud by hand. So that's why they use bots to go and automate the process of triggering it, because you're not going to do it by hand for half a cent or whatever it may be. But it does pose some really interesting problems when UK is on the list. So if we just go back a couple of slides, which kind of show the country chart, you can kind of see, this one. These are the countries where this fraud typically occurs from. So when this kind of attack or this kind of fraud is happening, you'll see a high bill increase from these country codes. and you won't see a correlating increase in good user metrics. So you won't see an increase in transfers, you won't see an increase in whatever it may be that you're monitoring for like a typical user account health. And they can do this abuse on any flow where you will trigger an SMS message. Typically, a lot of companies do it on sign up. So as part of the sign up process, you'll send a PIN to your prospective customer so that they can type it in and verify it's their phone number and they're unique. A lot of companies use this for anti-fraud measures. And what they're doing is they're just going to that part of the sign up flow and triggering this to one of their numbers they have in one of these regions over and over and over and over again. So what you can actually expect is you'll see a large volume of SMS, but they're not even bothering to open the account. So they're actually abandoning once they get the text message. Then they don't respond to the text message. They don't type in the PIN. All they're after is getting you to trigger that text message.
So if I'm a bank or a fintech, kind of what am I looking out for? Obviously, I'm not seeing all these new accounts from Tanzania or Sudan, but what am I looking out for to say, there might be a trend here that we might be getting attacked or we're losing a lot of money due to this, where we should see it where within the organization or within, our financials?
Right. Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's kind of funny. It's not really something people are looking for because it's not typically something you kind of expect to see. Most fraud teams are not monitoring their bill, the SMS bill. Like that's not typically an area where you're like, yeah, I'm going to monitor how much money we're spending on our OTP flow every year because that's the identity team or some other team's job that kind of own that. But we're seeing that shift because now those teams are like, well, we actually don't know how much our bill's going to be month to month because we're getting hit with this fraud where people are abusing our OTP process. So it is moving a little bit more to like, hey, can you guys take a look at figuring out why is our bill so high in these and they're basically deemed high risk countries. And you can kind of see on the list, these aren't the kind of regions you expect super high growth from, maybe outside UK. I guess it would actually depend on what your market is. If you're a US company, you would kind of typically not expect to see high increases and spikes in activity from, some of the countries on this list. So it's a pretty clear correlation when you start seeing, okay, my bill is going up. That's unusual. Traffic activity otherwise hasn't really changed too much. Why is there so much increase in our SMS, / telephony bill? And when you dig into it, you'll see that, okay, it's not coming from US, which is maybe where we're getting our most growth from. It's coming from all these other kind of strange country codes that we don't see corresponding, typically revenue from perhaps. And that's kind of where you would pretty quickly realize that, yeah, we just got, and we're seeing very large bill repercussions. We had one customer we worked with where it was $1 million in a week, the attackers run up in cost. Wow. Like it's serious dollars. And typically it's in the hundreds of thousands a week. Like that's a bit more normal. So if your bill is, a couple of million a year, you're starting to see a couple 100,000 extra a week. Like that's going to run some red flags. And it's kind of tricky thing to deal with. So we've seen different ways companies are solving for this. It's a bit of a whack-a-mole, and some of them are doing the more extreme, let's just stop receiving text messages from these countries where we see it. And then the attackers just simply pivot to other countries. So then you're on the whack-a-mole ball game, unfortunately. And you're also completely disabling the SMS process for any legitimate customers from those regions as well. If you go to the next slide,
and as a reminder, if anyone has questions, feel free to input them, whether it be on this particular topic or any other related topic as we continue to move through here.
Yeah, maybe from Bosnia, you're not expecting a lot of traffic, but I can tell you right now, from the UK, that's not really a region where you can just disable your SMS OTP processes, right? So, then we've started seeing people figure out, okay, so if we can't disable SMS, can we force adoption for different forms of authentication? Can we move away from SMS? If this is now becoming too expensive, fraudsters have figured out how to monetize it, we don't have good ways to control it, should we start looking at alternative ways of doing authentication? Problem is, those are all very lengthy conversations, like changing how authentication works, especially if you want to go from SMS login to token-based. You need to get the consumers to go and enroll in that. Like that's not the kind of thing you can just kind of mandate, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That could take months, potentially years even in some cases, to get consumer uptake. All the meanwhile, you're getting hammered with these high cost bills on a week-to-week basis.
And if you
So
change something, you're also getting hit with consumers being unhappy that this has changed. And
right.
all right, I can't get my PIN now. And now what's my authentication mechanism? Kind of, so you're getting good customers starting to get annoyed with you if you begin to look at changing it, or if you stop, if you cut it off for whatever reason, because you're getting hit so much. And then it brings up a different problem about customer experience and what a good customer is going through versus stopping the bad customers.
Yeah, right. So then you need to start thinking about, okay, what can I do to supplement the SMS process? Because I probably can't get rid of it overnight. And maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense from a long-term standpoint. So that's where you need to start doing things like, okay, is there any risk assessment I can do on the phone number? A lot of the telephony vendors people work with do have some kind of risk assessment features. And that's kind of one route you can kind of explore. The other route is, because the only way the attackers can make money from this attack is using automation, like they're never going to be profitable doing it by hand, so that they won't bother doing it by hand. Instead, look at also implementing security checks in front of the MFA that prevent people from using bots and scripts to hammer this process. And it's kind of interesting because we saw people shift away from, okay, and because we have MFA, we're not too worried about credential stuffing. So they can credential stuff the login. They can't get past MFA, so we're not too worried about it. So they don't typically have strong bot mitigation on login. Some like we see this more in the fintech world. But because of this, it kind of goes back to, well, you don't just need strong bot mitigation for cred stuffing, you also need it to protect your MFA mechanism itself. So you kind of need to start thinking about, how do I protect the mechanism that's triggering and causing the loss as well. And that, ultimately is kind of one of the better ways to kind of address this. Then you can maintain the feature functionality for the good users, but you take away the profit capability for the bad actors. But yeah, it's definitely kind of a different thought process and a bit of a different muscle, because immediately you think, okay, SMS fraud, what do I do about the SMS piece? When the answer is actually, you need to kind of get in front of that part and prevent the mechanism they're doing to distribute the kind of fraud.
We did have a question come in here from Anil. What are some of the, looks like it's a related question, what are some of the SMS related fraud from an end consumer perspective?
Yeah, that's of course a slightly different kind of problem, in the sense that what we're talking about here is a kind of fraud that impacts the fintech. When we're talking about kind of fraud that impacts the consumer, then you have, there's kind of a wide range where people are trying to phish to steal your OTP. Phishing attacks are very common, where we've seen really advanced versions of phishing attacks that are actually designed to overcome multi-factor authentication, where what they do is, they'll send it a phishing link. Consumers will unfortunately click these links, go to a fake version of your login. They'll type in their username and password. And typically that's kind of where a phish ends. And you've still got OTP protecting it, so they can't get into the account. But this new flavor of phishing technique, what they do is they, in real time, send the username and password to your real login server. And then that triggers the real OTP back to your actual consumer's device. And then the phishing site updates and says, now type in your OTP into the login. And then they send that to your real server, and now they've got access to your account. So there's a kind of a new form of kind of at scale phishing, where they can actually bypass, and not just SMS, by the way, that also works with hard tokens, soft tokens, all kinds of stuff. So that's a scary one. And then the other kind of SMS fraud is, of course, people pretending to be you and reaching out. One we were discussing a little bit earlier was, with the bigger banks, for example, the spray and pray approach works pretty well, but the bigger banks also have the best security mechanism. So if someone's kind of reaching out at massive scale, they're going to target the top 4 banks, just because there's a higher chance of those users having an account at one of those top 4 banks. The smaller fintechs don't really get the spray and pray attacks because the user accounts are too low for the hit rate to make sense. but they do look at things like Facebook and support channels, and they try and figure out if someone is a customer of yours. If they can find out someone's one of your customers, then they will do targeted attacks where they might use SMS to reach out and claim to be a support agent. If someone's typed a message on one of your Facebook messages saying, I'm having trouble logging in, can you get back in touch with me? Fraudsters are also monitoring your Facebook pages for that kind of stuff, and they'll send them a DM on Facebook, or they'll, it's unfortunately actually pretty easy to find someone's phone number. There's a website called usphonebook.com. There's many of these, or you can just go to the phone book. If you have the person's name and the country or the state they're in, you can find out pretty much within 5 minutes what their phone number is and what telco they use and all these kind of things. It's all pretty accessible data, unfortunately. So yeah, they'll go run phishing scams of SMS.
Related to kind of some of the stuff we've seen the last couple of weeks, which is people leaving smaller institutions, maybe with deposits going to larger institutions. Do you see a time of crisis as maybe a time that these fraudsters would exploit? And if you're a small bank, a big bank, or a fintech, that maybe your antenna goes up a bit more now, and some of these SMS style attacks, you'd be more keen to look and say, hey, there's a lot of chaos going on in the market. We really should be more on the lookout, for fraud, because they would try to exploit kind of people leaving and moving their money maybe to different institutions.
Yeah, if you let me screen share, I'll show you something that's quite fascinating, specifically to that topic. So, we and many others in the tech space, customers of SVB, of course, and we pretty quickly put up the warning flag that, hey, a lot of people are asking to change their bank details for legitimate reasons. They want to go have deposits sent somewhere else. There's a lot of deposit movements happening now, probably the largest amount in tech history is from that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
And there's a huge amount of scams going around where they're trying to pretend to be the companies sending out those deposit details so that they can, of course, get the bank details sent into their account. And there's a bunch of tools and platforms that are actually tracking phishing domains associated with these kind of things. This is one we're aware of, where these are all domains that were generated over the last week or so that are all specifically targeting phishing. And they're trying to drive consumers to either go to these sites to log in, and then of course they have the login details to go log into SVB's portal, or they're trying to separately drive traffic where they're reaching out to finance people at different companies and saying, hey, yeah, we're gonna change our banking details because of XYZ reason. There's a lot of activity from criminals right now that's very timely, and they're really good at this stuff. Anytime, any time-based event where there's an opportunity to make money, they're on it. They're on it in the day. It's kind of fascinating to watch how quick they are to kind of jump in the trenches and figure out how to scam people out of money. They're very agile, unfortunately, for all of us.
And so how do the either big bank, small bank, medium bank, or big, small, medium-sized fintech kind of combat some of this? It's clearly not, as we were talking before, it's not a silver bullet. But there are steps and things that you can take to ultimately put up better defenses, or at least recognize these things quicker to maybe make different decisions.
Yeah, and it's always kind of follow the money. The best line of thought we always have, when it comes to preventing bad actors, I think there's really three strategies that work, that will continue to work, and there's no reason why they should ever stop working. So that, from a strategy standpoint, I would recommend firstly, increase the cost for the adversary, having different security mechanisms, having different steps that they need to go through, risk-based or whatever that may be. You want to continue to raise the cost for them to target, you or your customers. The second is decrease the value. So even if they can compromise an account, have other mechanisms and checks in place so that it's really hard to move money out of an account. So you can actually figure out how effective the banks are at this by going and looking at the resale value of an account with a balance. For example, typically a bank that had a bank account that you can buy on, say, the dark web that has a balance of, say, $10,000, you can buy that account for about $500 because it's actually really hard to get the money out of the account. So even if you have the login credentials, it's still really difficult to transfer money out. Banks are actually quite good at stopping fraudulent transfers, which is amazing. Some other banks have a worse ratio where it might be it's $2,000 to buy a $10,000 bank account. Guess what? That bank is much easier to get the money out of because of,
Yeah.
that's why it's cheaper, right? That's why the ratio, that's why it's more expensive, because the ratios. So it's kind of fascinating. You kind of look at that as like a proxy for like who's actually the hardest bank to move money fraudulently out of. It's a really strange way to kind of look at it, but it is a kind of a good proxy because again, they follow the money. So again, increase the cost first and foremost by making it hard to get in the first place, decrease the value by making it really difficult for them to do anything, or the time to value, make that harder. So, the way we think about it at Arcos is we really protect the front door, so log in or sign up, but we share all our data with our customers. So even if the attackers do get past us, they are really empowered to prevent them from doing anything in the accounts, which is, again, kind of decreasing the value. And then the third strategy, and it's a little bit hard to do for some companies, smaller companies can't really do it very easily. The bigger ones definitely do, is real world consequences. You want to be kind of known as a company that if someone comes after you to commit fraud, like it's high stakes. Like you'll get the police involved, you go after them, you'll litigate, you'll do whatever it takes. It's not just we're protecting ourselves, but if they get in and get out, well, we missed it. Like make it difficult for them every step along the way, in intrusion and extraction, and then even if they are ultimately successful, persist, go after them, and you'll get a reputation that, hey, don't bother, like go after someone else, it's easier, and they're not going to come after you, kind of thing. So they're
Two
really
questions. Two questions come to mind with that. One is that, do you think sometimes, either the bank or the fintech, whoever might have been attacked or who had gotten it scammed, um, has in the past or haven't been as vocal, or haven't talked about it as much as maybe they should, because there's an embarrassment factor, or that element, versus maybe what you were saying, which is, hey, we're going to go to the mat to prove that we are going after the fraudsters. And there's kind of this balance of, hey, we don't want to look bad, but hey, we want to look tough. And so how do you kind of talk to a fintech or a bank and walk them through maybe how to handle something like that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And it's also one of the biggest disadvantages we have, all of us have, in security, is it's typically a topic, as you say, something people don't want to talk very much about. And unfortunately, the adversaries that we go up against are sharing this in the easiest of ways. Anything and everything they've learned, they share immediately. Anything, any scam or scheme, it's, they're using Telegram, they're using Discord, they're using Facebook, they're using, like, you can just read about like pretty advanced, getting on YouTube and search stuff, and it'll teach you how to run scams. Like it's super easy to get access to the information to run them. But because of the sensitive nature, as you allude, most companies don't talk too much about it. Now, there are definitely communities which are a bit more close-knit, where CISOs get together, they share what they're seeing. And that's great. We obviously always encourage more of those kind of things. You definitely want to talk to your peer companies. Like, don't try and do security in isolation. Like, you want to definitely have that through the lens of, and of course, that's why places like FinTech Nexus exist, right? So you have an opportunity to go talk to your peers.
Ultimately, even if you're a big bank A and you get attacked, yes, it might be good if they move from you to big bank B, but ultimately it's not good for anyone if big bank A is attacked and you just pushed them to big bank B. Ultimately, both banks should want to encourage each other to be better protected.
Yeah, from an ecosystem standpoint, that's absolutely correct. And that's where, and they do that. They definitely do talk, and they try and they share what information they can. They share fraud rules and things like that. And there's obviously kind of the alliance between the bigger banks that do this sort of stuff. The fintech world's a little bit more kind of not quite at that level of sophistication, because it's a lot younger, right? These businesses in the fintech space are much newer, I would say, more modernized, and these kind of things, but they're also a little bit behind in the many years of having to combat and deal with these kind of problems that the bigger ones have had the opportunity to
does the fintech in some ways think, because they have maybe slicker technology, their tech stacks are quote unquote more modern, that they get a false sense of, hey, we're protected. We're not the slow, spaghetti version of technology at the big bank. We have the latest technology. We've implemented a couple of tools, so we are fairly safe. When we think about it, does it give them maybe a false sense of protection?
Yeah, I think it's, again, fraudsters follow the money. So they still attack the big banks, even though they might be the most secure, just simply because there's more to go after. The fintechs, for now, and the fintechs want to be kind of attacked because it means that they're doing a lot of good things from a growth standpoint. Like if you're under attack from criminals, that means you've got something of serious value that people want. And unfortunately, success breeds that kind of problem. So it kind of comes with it. A lot of criminals will abuse things that are not consumer related. So for example, like promo codes, like if you're giving away some money to encourage people to create an account, which is a pretty common thing in the fintech world, they will abuse that very, very heavily. That's the kind of fraud. But you might not really be seeing like account takeover fraud because you might not just have enough consumers using your product that warrant the time and investment for a criminal to come after you. That will change as you mature. So, I think it's kind of, there is a bit of a false sense of security, but I think it's more through the lens of they don't see the pain yet, and that's because they're not big enough in some cases. The more mature, larger, stable fintechs absolutely are seeing the same kind of attacks and pain as the big older banks, I would say, because again, there's enough value now there for those criminals to come after them. But it really is just a calculus for the criminals around what's my cost, what's the effort, what's the chance I'm going to get out. It might be the equal amount of cost to get into an account because they may have used modern technology on like the login stack, but the value for getting in might be a lot higher because it's actually a lot easier to transfer the funds out, for example, because they don't have as mature fraud strategies, which we also typically see. So yes, they may be more modernized in some parts of the chain, but probably not in others. So again, it's kind of that balance. And if you're a smaller fintech, you don't really have the budget to have the same security as like a big bank. And that's just a reality. Like, doesn't matter how quick you are at writing code. Like these things cost money to kind of maintain, staff, buy vendors, whatever it may be. So there is just a simple balance of like, how much am I going to potentially lose based on my customer size versus, how much of a target am I? But yeah, it's super dynamic. Like it's such an endless topic you could talk to for days and days on, just simply because there's so many different ways criminals can make money from it, and there's so many different strategies per different technique the criminal has. Like we're just talking today about something super niche, like attacking OTP SMS. Like how niche is that in the scheme of things? But there's so many other facets to how they attack banks and fintechs, and there's different techniques for each of them as to how to best mitigate. There's certainly no silver bullet.
As a reminder, if you have questions, please input them. What are, you've kind of touched on a couple of things related to back to our topic, and what are some of the tools that are available to fight these SMS attacks? I know we've touched on a couple of them, but maybe if you can go into a little bit more detail there, and then ultimately what endpoints should be prioritized for the either the fintech or the bank that's looking to, all right, this is now a problem I'm aware of, I've heard of it, but now I've got a little more detail. How do I then better protect the organization?
Yeah, this particular kind of fraud typically exists on three flows. Login as part of your MFA, forgot password, because typically you're triggering SMS on the forgot password as part of the account recovery. And then, of course, enrollment, where you may be triggering SMS as part of the user onboarding to verify that they're a unique phone number. And that's typically, again, done for identity and security reasons. So they're kind of the three big areas that you would focus on for this specific problem. In terms of mitigation capabilities here, we've seen a number of things where people try and rate limit by country. So if you're seeing too much text volume from one region, limit the ability for people to use text messages from those regions. Unfortunately, that has legitimate user implications, or disabling those regions, like I mentioned, has pretty substantial user implications, of course. Using intelligence on the phone numbers to try and identify, is this a high-risk phone number? Was it recently created? Like, does it have any track record? Has anyone owned it previously? Like, there's some data there that you could use to ascertain if it's a long-standing phone number, then, hey, maybe you'll always let it in. And just the ones that look more illegitimate, you rate them at those kind of ones. So that's another potential strategy. And then also layering in front of it, preventing the mechanism of triggering the OTP, which ultimately is done by bots, just because it's such a low profit margin per attempt, but really high profit margin in aggregate. So that's obviously something attackers use bots for. And you can do a number of bot mitigation strategies, rate limiting, fingerprinting, device intelligence, IP address, spoofing, showing a challenge in front of it. There's a whole bunch of different potential opportunities there.
We had another question come in from our audience. The question is, SMS is usually a default method of sending a OTP, but companies typically offer a voice as a fallback method, usually as a consideration of accessibility. Can you speak to the cost incurred by attacks on voice versus SMS?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a lot worse. So voice is more expensive to deal with. It's definitely more expensive to call somebody than it is to text somebody. And the same fraud exists in the voice channel. So fraudsters get the same affiliated fee through voice. We tend to see voice a little bit less often, but you are correct in the sense that it is definitely more accessible doing voice than it is doing, although, phones are pretty good from an accessibility standpoint from text nowadays. You can only get your phone to kind of read out the text message. So I don't know how reliant we are on voice as an accessibility feature, just because I think phones have gotten quite good from an accessibility standpoint. But yes, unfortunately, it's even more lucrative for criminals to go after voice. So if you do offer voice, that could be even more damaging. So yeah, same kind of problem and same kind of mechanism though. It's still going to be an automated attack approach. And additionally, the attackers, I think they prefer SMS because once they trigger it, they've been paid. But with phone number, they have to accept the call, so they have to additionally set up infrastructure to be able to connect the calls, which is more difficult for the frauds. To kind of going back to cost versus reward and effort, even though it's more profitable, you probably won't see initially the attacks there because again, they have to set up all the infrastructure to automate the phone reception part.
What about working with the telcos in any way? I mean, are banks, or do you recommend, or do you guys work with, kind of what role, or do they even play a role in helping, with some of this, this type of fraud that we've been speaking to?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The telco is the ultimate connector of the, you want to send a text message, I'm sending it through my pipes, then they're getting the text message.
Yeah.
The other part of the telco's relationship is they're the one ultimately giving out these affiliated numbers. So there's a different kind of problem there as well. But it's kind of two steps removed from the fintech because no one is working directly with telcos because there's too many of them. It's too complex. All the telcos we're talking about here are largely in countries that, it's just really hard to kind of, different language. There's all these it's just really kind of hard to do that. So that's why we work with, all the fintechs work with vendors that send the text messages on your behalf. There's a large number of different telephony, SMS vendors, phone vendors that do this, and they do the hard work of going to the telcos, building those relationships, getting all the pipes and all that kind of stuff. But the vendors that are used to send the text messages also kind of wipe their hands of it and say, well, you're telling us to send a text message to this user, so we're going to charge you for that.
Mm-hmm.
If you think it's fraudulent, just don't make us send text messages to them. But then the fintech's going to be like, well, I didn't know it was fraudulent. They're abusing my SMS. Like, I'm not in the business of SMS. Like, aren't you in the business of SMS? So it's kind of a weird situation where the SMS providers, they have an incentive to stop it because they don't want people to stop using SMS.
Yeah.
And there's too much fraud through the SMS channel and they can't stop it, then you'll look to alternative methods of authenticating your users. You won't use SMS. And that's a bad thing for the SMS providers. So they definitely do want to stop it. But they're also not really well equipped to stop it because all the information they have is you've told them to send a text message to this number. Really, the best place to stop the problem is unfortunately on the fintech's part because you have full control over the user. the user experience, the user journey, when text messages are sent, these kind of things, which these SMS providers don't. You can, of course, say, hey, here was a large number of fraud that we received. We want to refute that. Problem is, it takes bandwidth, time, resources to go to the forensics, to find the phone numbers, to go lodge a ticket with your SMS provider. Again, fintechs are in the business of building better finance tools for consumers. They're not really in the business of combating SMS fraud. So it's just kind of a spot where it's kind of too hard and too much effort for the teams to kind of mitigate it, and it's kind of not so expensive to kind of eat it a little bit in some of these regions where people are just kind of eating these costs. And that unfortunately drives more adoption from fraudsters because they're kind of getting away with it. So there's no consequence.
Yeah.
It's relatively easy to do, and the value is pretty high if you can use automation. So unfortunately, we're kind of failing at all three of the pillars, which is you should have consequence, you should decrease the value, and you should increase the cost. And yeah, again, that should be the typical motto for any problem you're feeling. It's like, okay, how do I do all those three things? What's the strategy that would help?
We had another question come in here from our audience. Why is it so difficult to identify / flag PRNs? What is a PRN? I'm not as familiar with that term.
Yeah, so this is kind of like the provider, and kind of there's a few ways, and this goes back to like telephony. It's kind of like telemetry. It's kind of like, what's the context of this phone number that's being used to trigger a text message and things like that. In some of these countries, you get really bad data. So the phone numbers that are premium or affiliated look the same as a regular residential phone number. Like the data is not very good. This is also one of the reasons why it doesn't really occur in the US, because it's very obvious if you're sending an affiliated phone number, like it's like a different number. Like in Australia, for example, like the phone starts with different numbers when it's an affiliated number. So for a fact it's affiliated. Like this kind of fraud just doesn't work there.
Yeah.
Because you would just not send messages to premium or affiliated numbers. You'd only send it to legitimate numbers. In a lot of these countries where they're high cost, like Indonesia, the infrastructure wasn't designed to be so obvious in terms of kind of what you're triggering. So that's just, I guess, kind of a legacy problem a little bit with kind of how the telcos set things up. And I just don't think there's really no incentive for them to change it. So that's kind of the other problem. So again, fraudsters just latch on to these little loopholes. And this is one that's existed for quite a while. It's just in the last 12 months, it's becoming more and more rampant and kind of moving from company to company. So if you haven't seen it yet, make sure someone's tracking the SMS bill, because when it hits really hard and really fast.
We have just a couple minutes left. If I want to end with, kind of looking forward a little bit. We've talked about, kind of number of things here. Obviously, some of the key things that a bank or a fintech might do to kind of identify some of this type of fraud. What do you advise banks and fintechs as a firm that is helping mitigate this, that works on bot mitigation? What are a couple of things that you can leave us with as we're wrapping?
Yeah, I think and I think we all kind of know it. SMS is a good fallback mechanism. It's probably not the future of OTP, I would say. I know there's a lot of work being done around things like passkeys and different authentication methods that aren't reliant on channels like this, that unfortunately we can get, like, you can kind of get hit with fraud just by having it as an anti-fraud mechanism, which is, there's a lot of irony, I think, in the fact that they're able to attack it through that lens. But again, I think the trick is, how do we balance the consumer adoption? And I'm not a strong believer we should put the onus of security on the consumer, because they're not really very good at it typically. Yeah. And it will unfortunately drive adoption away from your companies if you're too heavy-handed in terms of security. So although I think the one big benefit the fintech world has over the other industries we work with is consumers realize it's important to protect their bank account. So that's that's a really big advantage that a lot of other industries, travel, tech, etc., don't really have. Like consumers really do want to protect their bank account, and I think typically when people have several passwords they reuse, the highest chance of having a unique account password that they don't reuse is the bank account one. So it's actually a good sign from that perspective. So we do have some room to play in terms of we can ask a little bit more from the consumers in this vertical versus what the other verticals can do.
Yeah, they're okay with more friction here than if they go to Netflix or if they go to Amazon or something. Like they want like that.
Yep,
Yeah.
they won't even turn MFA on. So at least we're in the point where they're enabling MFA and they get it, and like that's not too much of a chagrin. But yeah, I think it's certainly a space where there is a little bit of room to improve authentication because again, people understand it a lot more here than they do in other industries.
Well, Kevin, I appreciate you coming on and sharing this wisdom with our audience. Thank you to the audience members who asked some questions. Special thanks again to Kevin and Arcos for their continued support. And we will see you again soon. Thanks so much, Kevin. Thanks so much, audience.
Thanks, everyone.